You've already met Jon Hillis, Mark Lutter, and myself, and we are now going to be joined by Elle Griffin, who's founder of the Elysian, and Daniel Thompson, founder of Noma Collective. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. To start us off, I would love to hear from each of you on what you feel like the problem we're really trying to solve by reinventing governance is. Is this about freedom? Is it about belonging? Is it about mobility or something else?
Economic development. I think governance matters for economic outcomes. Countries are rich because they tend to be well-governed, and they're poor because they are poorly governed. And if we can improve governance, hopefully we can make poor countries richer, and also rich countries even richer.
Yes, and I think it's also about culture, and I think that it's up to every generation to figure out how they want to try to take a new stab at the problem. And you look at various versions of everything from back to the land movements, in the United States to political movements over time, and I think it's just one of the best opportunities that exist in the world to try to rethink what does it mean for us to live together and to govern ourselves, and so just getting the opportunity to take a new stab at that, I think, is a font of cultural opportunity.
Yeah, I want to add to that because throughout history we've had these periods of times where we had a lot of flexibility in our governance. If you think about the Enlightenment, everyone was like, maybe we don't have to have monarchy. What should we do instead? And then they were all writing all these pamphlets and ideas and books imagining what the ideal governance could look like. And I think that proved very fruitful. Some of them, if you think about the Federalist Papers or Common Sense by Thomas Paine, we had these books that kind of were writing the Constitution of the United States, and that was true of a lot of all the other governance that came out of that era as well. So I think there's no reason why we can't do that again today and still think through, okay, we've been in this period for a while, what should we do next? Surely this isn't just as it should be forever and ever from here on out.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that by saying that when I look at a lot of people, they seem unhappy. We're told that we have everything we need, and they're still looking for something, and I think that sparks change. So for me personally, in the Noma community, though, there's just so many people that really are looking for something different, and I think that's where this all starts. And so, yeah, that's how I see it.
Wonderful. And I guess maybe to refer back to our taxonomy of network societies as introduced by Jon earlier on, I'm curious, how do digital first and physical first approaches to new societies learn from and strengthen each other? If we think about those the two ends of the kind of spectrum, what is that juicy middle that Jon spoke a little bit about in everyone's opinion here?
I can start out there. I think one helpful framework for thinking about this is that you sort of have to use an analogy from crypto. There's different layers. You have L0, which is sort of the existing nation states that have the territory and the governance structures, and then there's sort of layer ones, these L1s, which are places like special economic zones that are built on top of that. And they create new governance structures, but they're not necessarily great at attracting people or communities. So you have these L2s, which are these communities Noma Collective, for example, which are these amazing global networks of people that need places. And so the L1s and the L2s, I think, actually can be very mutually beneficial working together, where one has the place and the governance, but not necessarily the community, and the other one has the community looking for physical places.
Yeah, and I would also say that we've already experienced this kind of right now, where it used to be your work and your government were rooted in where you live, but already work is now in many places digital, where we can log into one Slack channel, quit that job, and then log into another Slack channel. So there are ways that economies are going online, and now the in-person part of our lives is where we live, and our friends and our community, and the governing bodies. So I think that these two things can kind of we can have this online reality at the same time that we're having this physical reality, depending on different parts of our lives.
If I can maybe ask a follow-up question to you there, Elle. Like, you've experimented with bringing your kind of online community offline for meetups around the world, for example. Do you see a big difference in how people interact in those kind of IRL environments versus digital environments?
Well, it is interesting because I would say that I'm a writer and I run a media collective, and I think that there's a difference between the readers who are really invested and are coming to the meetups and the commenters who have, something to say about each thing you write. They're not necessarily the same person. In fact, a lot of the people I met around the world, I did meet online first, but kind of they would email me back on the things that I wrote or things like that. It wasn't necessarily that, or they would participate in our Slack channel and we would get to know each other that way. And then we would have this in-person gathering that was kind of more about, let's geek out about writing and the internet and things that are not related to what I'm talking about in my newsletter. So it kind of became more, less about the newsletter in a way, and just kind of more about, we're all just hanging out, getting to know each other, which is fun.
Anything to add to that, Daniel?
Let me think. I think it's really amazing to see people be able to come together in the internet, like-minded concepts. Like, you were just completely bound by your geographical location, and it must have been really hard to find, niche, or people to align with niche concepts. But then ultimately, I think there's nothing more valuable than like sitting across from someone and having that interpersonal communication in a physical space. So I really think that, the fast track of connections is what the internet's given us, but ultimately we can't lose track of like just sitting in front of someone and having a conversation. And I think maybe we did lose a little bit of that, and now that's why we're seeing such a focus into physical spaces again, because we can't forget how to communicate in the real world.
I mean, one way I think about the last, let's call it 80 years in the US and broadly across the West is there's been an increased ideological sorting mechanism, right? Previously, Republicans and Democrats would live as neighbors and like get along. Now, Democrats live in cities, Republicans live in rural areas. Like neighborhoods are extremely ideologically sorted, right? Professions are very ideologically sorted. Now, for example, a lot of tends to be a little bit more Democrats. Like Democrats don't want their kids to marry a Republican, right? So what used to be maybe ethnic boundaries are now like ideological boundaries. Not to say like racism is gone or anything, but just like ideological boundaries have become much more restrictive in some sense, and like the sorting is much stronger. And this has kind of begun to filter down into subcultures, and to the extent like San Francisco is ahead of everyone else because the internet and like the future happens here first, right? You've got all these weird like hacker houses and co-living houses with like slightly different cultures, slightly different rules. You've got the rationalists in Berkeley East Bay, who's kind of a little bit of like a weird death cult that has become extremely like influential. And
the
so,
death cults came onto the stage sooner than I'd anticipated.
So I think we are seeing much more like ideological sorting starts online, begins to happen in the physical world, and I think that trend is probably going to increase, or at least continue.
Do you think we're at a time of new ideologies? I often think of it like the kind of nomad population that SafetyWing and Plumia serve is not really a population that's represented in conventional political ideology. You have the left and the right, but where do tech progressive, pro-immigration, globally minded children of the internet go in a country like the US or the UK? What do you guys think? Are we at a time when new ideologies are kind of taking off, especially at the fringes where we all work?
Yes. I mean, taking away from the fringes, just like obviously in the U.S. there's been like a massive political realignment in the past 8 years. President Trump was not a Republican figure; he was a Democrat 20 years ago. We're seeing massive realignment across the West. We're seeing young people, for example, have started. Historically, young people always voted more left than their parents. For the first time in the last administration, young people voted more right. minorities voted a lot more Republican in the last election. So just like on a basic like election scale, there are substantially different voting patterns than had for the previous, like, I don't know, 50 years or something. I think on a micro level, right, like we're seeing the failure of a lot of these previous institutions. The US responded very ineffectively to COVID with the exception of Operation Warp Speed. And when those failures happen, there's space for people to create new ideologies, new understandings of the world that can help bind them and explain the world in a better way.
I've been thinking a lot about this actually, and I see a lot of merging of ideas, kind of in different formats. So, you know, taking something like what was it called? The Nomad, the new product?
Nomad Citizen.
Nomad Citizen. You know, this, like the idea of giving, you know, support and you know, cover to employees is not a new thing, but it's then taking that idea and merging it with this new idea of digital nomadism and then offering that same product. Like, it's happened a lot in music in the last 20 years where you've got this kind of merging of genres constantly. And so you've got this like really kind of like a bunch of more kind of niche styles of music. And I think like with ideologies, it's kind of going that way too a little bit. You've got this kind of like, oh, well, you know, my mum had this idea, my dad had this idea. We're living in this kind of internet age. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of that happening.
I think also if you focus on ideas, it's a little bit more uniting than focusing on political parties. Even a product like Nomad Citizen or SafetyWing, that's pretty universal. Anybody could be interested in universal or health insurance or things like of that nature. And I think that's true even in the media. When we try to focus on ideas, we focus on solutions and things everybody can get behind. And I think that's a little bit more uniting. Even if we're going to talk about ideal cities and countries, I would like to see a world where the United States is a bunch of different countries that are all federated together in unique ways. And in that case, there wouldn't need to be all this crazy polarization because each individual community could decide what it wanted to look like and what would best represent them. And maybe that could be interesting, more interesting than trying to get a wide swath of people to all agree on what we should do for governance when maybe small groups of people do have an idea of some unique governance that they would like to try. And I think laboratories of governance would be very interesting to see and are interesting to see around the world to see what would we do in each individual community. And that's a forward-thinking conversation rather than like a what do we not like or what do we want to critique about our current government. We just say what ideal government would we build in our local community.
I love that because I think you're really touching on an important point that sometimes gets overlooked in conversations in this space, which is that the challenge ahead of us is not to upload what already exists to the cloud. It's in fact to design things using the tools and technologies that we have today, not simply bringing the 20th century institutions and tools to today, but actually building ones for the 21st century. And I think we're going to have an opportunity to get a bit more into some of that. But where we've gotten to in this discussion segues me nicely into another question I wanted to ask, which is, how do each of you think that identity is changing when people can belong to multiple communities, whether they be physical, digital, and hybrid at the same time?
Specifically with work, or are you thinking just generally?
I'm speaking more in general, but if you want to answer with regard to work, that is also welcome.
It's kind of a human instinct to constantly try and put us into buckets, right? And now I think we're sitting in multiple buckets, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's fine to be part of multiple clans, unless it's like, you know, soccer teams or something like that, then maybe not. But yeah, I like the idea of being part of loads of different communities and that making up my, you know, my DNA or whatever. I find that to be kind of where I learn the most. I think that's what's so interesting about digital nomadism is you get to go to all of these different communities and pick what you like of it, right? Like, you know, going to Japan and realizing you shouldn't wear shoes in the house is probably a good thing, right? Like that's what I learned when I went there. You know what I mean? I feel like that's a really beautiful thing.
To me, the major kind of, I guess, shift in identity that's happened is, right, nationalism was extremely important in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Now it's like far less important. And a lot of the let's call it underlying logic of human society is basically like who uses violence and how. And nationalism was previously an ideology that was propping up the nation state and kind of justifying and legitimizing and using its existence as well as like enforcing its existence. And now I think the question, like one of the big questions of the next 30, 50 years is going to be, as nationalism recedes as an ideology, as people adopt like other identities, other interests, what happens and how do nation states adjust, change in response to people being far less likely to kind of throw down their lives for their governments and to like, have a fundamentally different relationship with their government.
Okay, to, I guess, come a little bit back in the conversation to a question I asked earlier with a slightly different lens. One of the issues that I'm aware of in the charter cities kind of movement is actually getting people to move to these new cities. So I believe Prospera has around 1,000 people living there right now. A lot of the online communities and collectives out there are into the tens of thousands of people. How do you think we can bridge those worlds? You know, if you have these people connected by ideas in the cloud, connecting, wanting to build stuff together, agreeing or disagreeing, but in productive ways, how do we kind of facilitate them actually coming together in larger numbers, IRL, offline? I'm sort of looking at Mark, but I feel like you'll all have something to say on this.
Yeah, so first of all, Prospera does not have anywhere near 1,000 people, unfortunately.
Well, that's what they tell you.
Yeah. I think it's maybe 1,000 e-residents. Yeah, the E there is carrying a lot of weight. Yeah, the reality is like very few of these places have very many residents at all. I think probably the leading example in the world right now in this movement in terms of like actual people living there at the moment, I think is probably Network School in Malaysia. And I don't know, you were just there, Daniel. How many people were there? Like a couple hundred max?
Yeah, they just hit 100 full-time residents,
Yeah.
which have said they're going to commit for a year, and then I think they have cohorts of a couple hundred coming through. So they're actually on their way to, I think, 500 plus that are there at any one moment.
Yeah, which is amazing, right? But that's like the world-leading example, right? So the scale here is still quite small. And the core problem is that, getting people to move to the middle of nowhere to live with internet strangers is a really high bar. It's a very hard thing to do. I've tried. And you can get people to do it in small numbers, but I think there's basically only two methods that seem to work. One is you get bigger groups of people together for smaller amounts of time, which then allows you to at least like build the density of relationships that can then translate into people making longer term commitments. So that's like the pop-up city movement or stuff like what Noma Collective does to bring together groups of nomads, build those relationships, and then try to instantiate small groups in the real world. Or, in the case of like Balaji, for instance, with Network School, you build a really big megaphone and have like a clear like ideological cleavage points, and just like lean hard into that and put out the bad signal and build a massive online audience and then convert a very small number of those people in person. Those are the only two methods that I think have actually worked so far. But no one's actually figured out how to do this at scale.
I think that we have figured out how to do it at scale. But you're meaning this in a different way than I am. But people move for access to jobs, for access to money. We know that you can put a Google campus somewhere and people will move to it to live there and work there. The Mormon church functions like a network state. They have their own social welfare fund, and people move to Salt Lake City to live there and have access to those resources and that community. People move for weather. This is why warm places are so in demand. People move to be by good schools. So I think that we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We just need to create the things that people, and I think this is where charter cities come in, because if you create a place with lots of jobs and capital, then people will move there and then they'll create the culture and everything else. I think it's almost a little bit backward to be like, okay, let's create the culture first and then everyone will move together, because we still need that we still need the jobs, we still need all the other things that we move for right now. So I kind of think that has to come first, and then we can create those communities.
Yeah, I agree with that. So Ciudad Morazan, one of the projects in Honduras, it's not targeting internet people, it's targeting average Hondurans. They've got 200 residents, maybe 300 if they finish the last housing development. And at least, right, to me, these are two separate things. It's like internet communities and charter cities. And there's some overlap, but like a lot less than people typically assume, where, right, like people are getting internet communities together, like this is a good event for it. Right, like a pop-up city is a good event for it. You don't need to live together 24/7, 365 with these people. You can live in like a normal city. And with a charter city, what you should do is focus really hard on like, who is my target market? And it's the vast majority of the time, it's not going to be random internet people who like the same blogs that you like. Right, the vast majority of the time, it's going to be people who want to make a little bit more money, who want better education, who want a better life for their children, just like standard reasons that we all have for living, that we all have for moving. And like, those are the people that the average charter city needs to target, not people who like the same blogs that you do.
Just to echo on the points that you guys made, I think that like the problems that you talked about, the reason why people move, they're all like global problems. Like everyone is affected by the weather, or everyone is looking to make more money. Whereas I think like the ideological framework around these new cities is a much smaller concept, and I think that's where it starts to become. I mean, we discussed this on our hike yesterday, but like I think it's a top of funnel issue personally. I think that like we need to get as many people thinking about these type of problems, and then I think we'll be able to get to a point where we hit critical